Hello everyone, this is Addie Podfic, back with another podfic. Today I will be reading Again I Burn, Can You Reach Out by Captain_Autumn on Ao3. Here's the summary. Or 5 times on the Argo 2 where Coach Hedge was the only one who noticed Leo not taking care of himself, and the one time it came back and kicked the rest of the 7 in the ass. Chapter 1. Injury. Honestly, for once, Leo's day had been completely fine. Well, up until the monster attack, of course. For once, the Argo 2 had actually managed to go most of the day without any monster attacks, which after the Scolopendra, or Shrimzilla as it had been known as, on the ship, they were a group of dyslexics with ADHD, and there was no way they would remember that name. Was a welcome reprieve. So, now they were on their way to Rome to save Hazel's brother Nico and to find the Athena Parthenos. Leo would be lying if he said he wasn't a bit nervous. But as always, he busied himself with keeping the Argo 2 running as best he could, and cracking jokes so he didn't end up getting stuck in his head. The further away from America they traveled, the more monster attacks increased, and by now they were getting attacked pretty much at least once a day. So the fact that they had managed to get all the way into the afternoon with no sign of any monsters at all, with good weather and calm water, felt like a near miracle. And of course, Leo managed to jinx it by remarking on it, even though it was just under his breath to himself. He had been standing on the deck of the Argo 2 and staring out at the scenery, watching the fluffy clouds drift slowly through the blue sky and the sun sparkling across the crystal clear water, feeling the gentle warmth of the sun rays on his face and the slight breeze ruffle his curly hair, breathing the smell of the ocean, albeit slightly salty air, breathing the smell of the clean, albeit slightly salty air, and for once just taking a second to stop rushing and have a small moment of peace in his chaotic, hectic mess of a quest. And just as he closed his eyes for a second, a small smile tugged on his lips from the feeling of the cold seawater splashing up and across his face. The serenity was broken by an ear-splitting screech. Leo's eyes snapped open, and he immediately spotted the monster, a swarm of what looked like birds, rapidly getting closer. He booked it to the doorway leading into the inside of the ship, where their warning button was. He pressed it, setting off the alarm and notifying everyone else on the ship that danger was incoming. The girls were the first ones to reach the deck. Leo thinks he remembers Piper mentioning they planned to have a girls' chat, whatever the hell that was. Annabeth running up the stairs first, celestial bronze dagger ready in hand, with Hazel and Piper hot on her heels. "What's attacking?" she asked Leo, who just pointed at the flock, which was still getting closer. "I'm not sure what exactly they are," he replied, "but I have a feeling they aren't regular birds. With how fast they're coming and with how sharp they look, or the fact that I'm pretty sure they're made out of metal, which birds should not be." He tried to joke, but it fell short. Coach Hedge was next, his trusty baseball bat already in hand, though Leo doubted it would be able to do much against the very angry, still rapidly approaching metal birds. And that was the last thought he managed to get in before he looked back at the birds and realized they were now upon them. Everything instantly turned into chaos. The birds' screeches hurt Leo's ears and made it hard to focus on not getting stabbed by what he realized were very annoyingly and painfully sharp beaks. All 5 of them on the deck tried to attack back, Coach Hedge swinging his bat around and actually managing to hit some, though it didn't seem to deter them. Annabeth and Piper trying to hit them with their daggers, and Hazel trying to hit them with their Spartha. Leo reached into his tool belt, desperately trying to find something to use as a weapon, but only ended up with a screwdriver. It immediately became clear that it wouldn't work very well, and he tried to knock a bird away from where it was swooping towards him, and instead had to use his arms to cover his face when it did nothing. He couldn't use his fire properly either, he realized, as he couldn't see well enough through the fast-moving birds and having to cover his face so he didn't have his eyes pecked out to see where the others were, and there was too much of a risk that he'd end up hitting one of them as well as the birds. And besides, he didn't even know if fire would even affect these birds, but he had a bad feeling that it wouldn't. He did end up managing to fight back, though, sending out tiny blasts of flame from his hands for only seconds at a time. He was absolutely certain none of his friends were within a couple feet of him. It didn't damage the birds, but it did get them to back off, though not for very long. Between the screeching of the birds and the yelling of demigods, Leo noticed the other members of the 7 reach the deck, jumping straight into the fray. Unfortunately, though, it became very clear that their weapons and powers weren't going to be much help either. Leo wasn't sure how long it had been before he ended up bumping into someone. They ended up with their backs pressed together, both trying to fend off the birds swooping at them. Leo realized it was Annabeth as soon as she let out a cry, sweeping her dagger and arc to get the birds to retreat, at least for a second. "So," Leo shouted over the noise, sending another blast of flame at the birds on his side. "Any clue what these things are, how we can get rid of them?" It was only because of how close he was to Annabeth that he was able to hear her. "They're Stymphalian birds," she yelled back. "Metal birds with bronze beaks and sharp feathers. They can launch at their victims." Leo shuddered. He had been more focused on the birds' beaks before, but now that he knew what to look for and was paying more attention, he could see a handful of what indeed looked like very sharp metal feathers sticking out of the wood on the deck. Leo had to take a second to get his heart unstuck from where it had jumped into his throat. "Great! Very handy information!" he exclaimed, trying to keep a normal upbeat tone to his voice to disguise the anxiety currently trying to turn his stomach inside out. "Now, would you also happen to know a way to defeat these things, or at least get them to go away? Because, believe it or not, I don't particularly want to become Leo Mintz right now." Annabeth gave an answer, but Leo ended up missing it as she had to move away from him to dodge a bird dive-bombing her from above, while he had to try and knock away a bird trying to add another hole to his face. "What?" he shouted. This time he heard her answer. "Noise! Loud noise! They hate it! It's how Percy and I got rid of them the first time, but I don't know where we could get that here." Leo hadn't known that the two demigods had met these flying metal deathbirds before, but he was a bit more focused on not dying right now to care about that. He could get the story later once they weren't at risk of becoming shredded demigods. With Annabeth's answer, though, Leo had a plan. He sent one last blast of fire to clear his vision, and even the handful of seconds it gave him was enough. He took quick note of where his friends were and where he was, and immediately took off running into the direction of the control panel. Unfortunately, since he was running past his friends and was therefore a lot closer to them, he couldn't use his little fire blast to make sure he was going in the right direction, but he trusted his knowledge of his ship enough to make it there. The Stymphalian birds didn't help either, and they didn't care that he was running and just followed him, continuing their efforts to give him hundreds more piercings than he ever wanted, and he had never even wanted one. Somehow, despite his lack of vision and the constant pain of the small nicks and cuts the birds were creating all over his skin, Leo managed to reach the control panel. Now that he was sufficiently far away from the others, he let out one bigger blast of heat to drive the birds even further away and give him just a bit more time to set everything up. When Leo had built the Argo 2, he had been on a time crunch and had only gotten the main and most important things in place before they had to leave. He did manage to get everything else built and sorted out along the way, and as things went on, he even found time to add smaller, barely relevant or useful things to the ship, mostly because he found it funny and it gave him something to do when he was bored, and also as a way to dodge the nightmares always on his heels, but going without a little bit of sleep never hurt anyone, right? The speakers he hid across the deck and common space downstairs had been one of those, though he had never got it completely set up. He had never tested it either, so as he added the finishing touches, he prayed to his father or any other god who might be listening that it would work. Just as he got the last screw tightened, the birds came back, pecking and scratching with a vengeance. It hurt like hell, even more so than before. Apparently his little fire trick had just made them angrier, if that was even possible. And it made his eyes water just slightly. That, unfortunately, also made it hard to figure out what he was going to play. Since none of the demigods had phones or any sort of music player, as devices often barely worked for them and instead just acted like beacons for monsters, Leo had been stuck to making the music system play CDs. Thankfully, this had worked out fine, as Coach Hedge had a strong love for them and was bringing a couple along. Leo wasn't sure how a CD player even managed to work on a ship full of demigods, as famously, even regular electronic devices could be finicky around them, but he wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. But the coach kept his CDs down in his room, which Leo was very far away from at this point and would not be able to get all the way there and back in time. As he looked around in a panic, still trying to dodge and knock away the Stymphalian birds from still attacking him, he spotted a familiar plastic square on a table in the corner. With the shouts of his fellow demigods and the screeching of the Stymphalian birds as his heroic background music, he lunged for the CD case sitting atop what he belatedly realized was Buford. And he also mentally promised to reward the table after this because he highly doubted it was pure coincidence that there just so happened to be a CD sitting right there in this situation. And dashed back to the control panel, one arm up and swinging at the birds and trying to keep them out of his face, while the other one opened the case, pulling out the CD and stuffed it into a speaker system. If he damaged the disc with his rough handling of it, he couldn't tell, but he's sure he'd be able to plead his case to the coach later once he had gotten these blasted birds to leave. As soon as he was sure the disc was in properly, he shut the lid and pressed play, and held his breath. He waited, straining his ears for something, anything, but nothing happened. Leo couldn't hear anything over the sound of the fighting, even though he was sure he had set the volume as high as he could get it, and his heart sank. The tears that had begun to be in his eyes earlier from the pain now welled up at the pure despair he felt. The one thing he could do to save them from these stupid flying metal pests had failed, and he had failed. But his friends were still in trouble, and the Stymphalian birds weren't going away anytime soon at this rate, so he scrubbed his hand over his eyes and ran back towards where the others were still fighting. As he was running, a bird shot straight towards him, but as all of his focus was on getting back to his friends, he only saw it at the last second. So when he spotted the missile of dark feathers and a deadly beak hurtling towards him, he threw himself to the side at the last second. He wasn't fast enough, though, as its beak managed to hit him in the side, cutting a line of burning pain across his skin. It wasn't deep, that much he could thankfully tell, but it hurt like hell. He didn't have time right now. He needed to get to his friends and find a different way to help, so he pushed himself off the wall and he had fallen against and kept going. And then, as Leo ran, he heard a crackle. For a second, he wasn't sure what it was, until it happened again, and then again, getting louder until he realized it was the sound of a guitar, plucking notes that were heavily distorted by the rudimentary sound system Leo had created, but slowly getting clearer and louder. Then the drums kicked in. The guitar sped up, sounding almost like a Wild West song, tense and dark and making Leo's heart beat faster in his chest, adrenaline kicking in and making the ache of his wounds fade from his attention. The music had gotten loud enough now that it could be heard over the sounds of fighting. The whole battle seemed to pause for a split second, as the Argo 2 crew looked around in confusion while the Stymphalian birds suddenly started flapping around like they were in pain, disoriented and halting their attacks on the demigods, instead scrambling to get away and flying into each other. The flock eventually got over the shock of the music enough to start flying away as fast as they could, and Leo almost felt like sobbing again, this time in relief. The group watched in silence as the birds flew away. It was like everything had been frozen in time for a split second, all their brains struggling with the sudden switch from battle to peace. And then the adrenaline crashes hit. Leo's legs nearly buckled, and he had to catch himself on a wall, ducking his head to try and hide the tears that had started welling up again. It took a second to just breathe, his heart slowly calming down from where it had been thundering in his chest. Leo brought his hand up again to wipe at his face and eyes, getting rid of any potential signs of tears, and also realizing just how many tiny cuts and scratches he had across his face, with how much the small amount of contact stung. When he lifted his head up again to check on the others, he saw them in similar situations. Leo's eyes were drawn to Coach Hedge first, which was easily explained by the fact that he was currently jumping up and down, waving his bat at the fleeing birds, cackling and seemingly barely injured. Probably because of the fur, if Leo had to guess. Jason and Frank were standing slumped together, Percy was leaning against the wall close by them, and the girls were sitting in a group together against the deck. Annabeth and Hazel were leaning over Piper, so he couldn't see her properly, but the three of them looked mostly fine, if murmuring a bit worriedly. It was then that Leo realized that the music was still playing, so he pushed himself off the wall again and stumbled back to the control panel, pressing the pause button with a sigh. It was like that one move had drained any last bit of adrenaline in his body. He felt like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and he had to press his hands to the control panel to prop himself up and keep himself standing long enough for him to feel like he wasn't about to fall to pieces. Took a second, but he managed, and when he turned back around, he was met with a worrying sight. Everyone had moved over to where the girls were sitting, now crowding around them slightly. Leo rushed over as quick as he could, which, albeit wasn't very fast, and saw the issue immediately. One of the birds had cut Piper's thigh, and it was bleeding pretty badly. Not terribly or fatal, but enough that she'd need to have some ambrosia or nectar quickly, or else she'd bleed out. Hazel was currently pressing what Leo recognized as the hoodie Piper had been wearing, wrapped around her waist before, against the wound to stem the bleeding, which was when Leo also noticed that Annabeth wasn't with the group anymore, Jason sitting where she was before. Leo felt his stomach drop at the sight of Piper's paler-than-usual skin, but he made sure to stay standing further back with Frank, Percy, and Coach Hedge. Piper was one of his best friends. Sure, they had known each other for years and had been each other's only solaces in the wilderness school. But he didn't want to crowd her, and Jason deserved the spot at her side more than Leo did, as Piper's boyfriend. Leo heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs and turned to watch Annabeth run through the doorway leading inside, rushing over and kneeling again next to Jason, handing Piper a piece of ambrosia, which she quickly ate. It took a second after she swallowed, but she let out a sigh of relief, her face relaxing from where it had been scrunched up in pain. She leant against Jason, putting most of her weight on him as the pain lessened and her body went limp. Hazel also eased up on the pressure on her leg, pulling the jacket back slightly to check on the wound, and Leo could see it already starting to close up. "Let's get her down to the infirmary," Hazel suggested, breaking the tense silence that Leo hadn't even noticed had formed until he nearly jumped at the sound of her voice. Jason nodded, already looking a lot less worried than before, and helped Piper up. He offered to carry her down, but she waved him off, simply slinging her arm around his shoulders and using him like a crutch. Though with how tall he was, she did end up slightly off the ground a fair amount of the walk down, which Leo found just a bit funny. So Jason took Piper down to the infirmary, Annabeth and Coach Hedge following behind to make sure Piper would be set up all right. If Leo had to guess, she'd probably spend a couple of hours resting there, maybe have a nap, but would be walking around and fine by tonight and completely back to normal by tomorrow morning. Piper was a badass like that. Hazel also went back inside to go clean off Piper's jumper and put it in the wash. For a second, Leo, Frank, and Percy just stood around awkwardly before Leo shook himself out of his stupor and said they should clean up. Cleaning up involved pulling the metal feathers out from where they had gotten stuck in the wood, moving things that had gotten knocked over in the fight back to where they were meant to be, and just otherwise making sure the ship hadn't sustained any significant damage. It thankfully hadn't, though the rough edges of the wood where they pulled the feathers out bothered Leo, so he made a mental note to come back later and sand them down so no one had to deal with potential splinters. The cleanup didn't take long, and by the time they were done, the sun was already starting to edge towards the horizon. Halfway through the cleanup, Hazel had come back and popped her head through the doorway, telling them to make sure to stop by the infirmary after they were done to get their scratches cleaned up. None of them were bad enough to need nectar and ambrosia. Only a handful probably needed band-aids, and she said they did need to get disinfected at the very least. Frank and Percy went down as soon as they were done, but Leo stayed just a little longer to sand the wood down before he forgot. As he walked towards the infirmary, the door opened, and out walked Piper, a bandage around her thigh and her head held high like normal. She smiled when she spotted them, and Leo could see Jason behind her, worry written all over his face. "Hey, Pipes," he grinned. "I'm guessing they couldn't keep you in there for long." She scoffed. "Hell no, the ambrosia worked just fine. If I can walk around, there's no point in spending my evening sitting in the infirmary staring at the wall. Jason's just being a worrywart. I'm fine." Leo wrapped his arm around her shoulder in a quick side hug and nodded sagely. "Of course," he said, his voice playfully serious. "That would be the worst form of torture for a warrior such as yourself. You gained another battle scar, and it should be shown off with the utmost pride and respect." Piper laughed, and Leo's heart soared, his pain and panic from before all gone. If his friends were happy, then he was happy. She reached a hand up and ruffled his hair, ignoring his cries of protest. "Thanks for cheering me up, Leo," she said quietly before continuing at a normal volume. "But you still need to get those scratches cleaned. You look like a mess." "Oi," he complied, but Piper just smiled at him teasingly, giving him a once-over. When she looked at his side, though, she frowned. "Your shirt's torn," she pointed out, and Leo froze. Somehow he managed to forget the cut on his side, and the reminder made him realize yet again just how much it hurt. When he looked down, though, he was relieved to see that the tear was small enough that you couldn't see the injury through it, and his shirt was loose enough that there wasn't any blood. "Oh, it's nothing." Leo waved it off. Probably just got ripped in the fight." Piper's frown disappeared. "Well, you're lucky you didn't get injured," she remarked. "Definitely got out better than I did." Leo just gave what he hoped was a playful smile back. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to feel right now. On one hand, he was thankful that she didn't know about his injury because it meant that she wouldn't fret over him, and her trust in him made him feel warm inside. But he had also known Piper for long enough for her to know he hated to admit when something was wrong. And for years, they had a system where no matter if Leo said he was fine, she would always do her own check to guarantee. It annoyed him at first, but very soon he realized it was because she cared, not because she didn't trust him. And he had come to maybe not like, but tolerate it, even if he hated it when she inevitably knew he was lying. So for her to suddenly not be doing that, it was strange, and for some reason it kinda hurt. "Now I'm hungry as hell, so I'm going to go get myself dinner," Piper announced, patting Leo on the head once more and walking off, waving her hand. "When you come to eat, you better have your face fixed up." "Piper, you're being mean," he whined after her, but she just laughed. As Piper walked off, Jason followed. Leo knew that he was ridiculously, if slightly unnecessarily, worried about her. But it still hurt when Jason didn't even acknowledge Leo was there, walking past without a wave or a smile or a nod or even just looking at him. But he didn't let himself think about it too long. Jason was just tired from fighting, and Piper had been pretty badly injured, Leo reasoned with himself. That was the only reason Jason had done that. Leo was here for a reason, though, and he had plenty of stuff to do, so he finally walked into the infirmary. Gleeson wouldn't say that acting as a chaperone to a handful of teenagers on a quest to save the Earth from, the Earth, essentially, would ever have been on his adventures to do bucket list. He certainly hadn't planned on getting attached to any of the kids in the slightest, but they had still managed to worm their way into his heart nonetheless, no matter how much he didn't want to admit it. Although he cared about all of them, two of them held a much bigger place in his heart than the rest, namely Piper and Leo. Gleeson had been in charge of looking after them at the wilderness school, after all, had kept them safe and protected as best he could until they were ready to be sent to camp. Melly said it was no wonder he got attached. They were both good kids. Piper was strong both mentally and physically. There was something Gleeson admired a lot. No matter the person. She was strong, but because she never had issues, she was strong, not because she never had issues, but because she had learnt to trust her friends and let them help her. He remembered what she was like when she first came to the wilderness school, lonely and isolated and almost scared of other people's opinions. She didn't take shit, of course. If someone had a problem with her, she'd fight right back, but it sometimes felt like she would put up a facade, a slightly different version of herself, someone who had no fear. So being able to watch her grow into herself and her fear made Gleeson ever so slightly proud. Leo had stood out to Gleeson from the second he first saw him. He was energetic and chaotic and brash, but simultaneously, if he wasn't making noise, then he faded into the background completely. Gleeson had been a protector long enough to have plenty of experiences with traumatized kids, and that amount of talent at hiding yourself without letting anyone even realize you were hiding could come from nothing else. Leo was also not what he expected from a demigod. Most of them had some inherent strength or capabilities, but Leo was almost always lagging behind in whatever physical exercise they did, which was pretty much every day. Honestly, if Gleeson didn't know Leo was one of the two demigods he had been tasked to pick up, he would have never guessed he was one. At the very least, Gleeson was glad the two of them had each other at the wilderness school. Piper was always standing up for Leo when he would be picked on for his lack of stamina or his looks or the strange way he spoke and acted, or whatever excuse teenagers could come up with to explain their hatred for the boy. At the same time, when Piper was harassed by the popular girls, Leo would always manage to use the contraptions he made with whatever scraps he could find to prank them. It hadn't taken long for Gleeson to realize he was a Hephaestus kid. Despite his scrawny nature, that sort of fidgety inventing couldn't come from any other godly parent. They had both been at the school when he had arrived, and when he first saw the two, he had actually thought they were siblings, despite the fact that they looked nothing alike. That sort of connection spoke of years of knowing each other, and it was only when he had a look at the school records that he found out their names and that they had only known each other for a year at best. In his calls with Melly, he often brought her up to date on whatever had happened since their last call, not going into too much detail to not worry her, of course, and almost every time she left to tease him about just how much he talked about Leo, about what he was doing, how he was going, all the amazing things he built on the ship. She called him out on the fact that he had gotten attached to Leo the most of the seven, despite how often he half-heartedly complained about the boy. He hadn't really noticed it until she said it, but when she did, he realized she was right. The amount of pride he felt when Leo showed off his abilities and how amazingly talented he was at inventing and problem-solving was comparable to a parent with their child's success. He even joked once or twice with Melly about adopting the boy, once Gleeson had accepted just how much she cared for him. With that, though, he also worried about how Leo worked on the Argo, too. From the very start of their voyage, Leo had a problem with overworking himself, forgetting or foregoing food, water, sleep, and taking care of himself to focus on the ship. With the lack of people, it hadn't been too bad, with Piper excelled at pulling him away from his work to function as a human being. Jason wasn't as good as Piper was, but he was close enough with Leo to be at least adept at it. But after the incident at New Rome, things got worse. There was suddenly 3 more people, none of which Leo got along with, and Gleeson could pretty easily tell just how bad Leo felt about getting possessed by the Eidolon, despite the fact that he couldn't have stopped it even if he wanted to or tried. There had been a bit of progress since then, after the Scolopendra and the visit to the Ichthyos Centaurus. Leo had solved whatever tension there had been between him, Hazel, and Frank, and Percy and Jason's experiences with the Eidolons had brought more understanding to the group and less hate towards Leo. However, along with the addition of more people came more problems, specifically personal ones. Gleeson understood they were all teenagers, they had plenty of issues to sort through already, let alone having to deal with them while simultaneously having to deal with the future of the entire world on their shoulders. So, drawing them away from each other into their couple pairs made sense. Those sorts of personal problems were best dealt with alongside those close to you. And each of the 3 couples on the ship cared about each other a lot, despite how young all of them were. That was what happened when children were put to the level of trauma that demigods had to deal with on the regular. Unfortunately, though, that also left Leo alone, as the only one not in a relationship. That was another reason why Gleeson cared about him so much. He saw that if he didn't keep an eye out for the kid, him and his problems would end up swept to the side, however unintentional it would be. The fight with the Stymphalian birds had certainly been difficult and left the entire ship's energy down, especially after Piper's injury, but it had gone far better than some of the other battles. After all, the rest of the crew had only sustained some scratches, nothing worth using ambrosia or nectar for. They had all come through the infirmary to get their scratches cleaned so far, apart from Leo. Speaking of the devil, Gleeson glanced at the door as it creaked open and Leo walked in. The boy's tan skin had a lot more scratches on it than any of the others had, which was slightly worrying, but also easily explained by the fact that he was the only one on the ship who didn't wield a weapon. The second thing he noticed was the fact that the corner of Leo's lips had turned down and his eyebrows were slightly furrowed. Small, but incredibly revealing signs that he was bothered about something. It had taken a while for Gleeson to pick up on his tells, and he was sure that the only other person who knew about them was Piper, maybe Jason. "About time you got here, Valdez," Gleeson half-heartedly grumbled, and instantly Leo's face switched to his iconic mischievous grin, the one that screamed not to be trusted with matches or sharp objects. No sign of anything beyond his normal cheer. "Well, the hero always needs his dramatic late entrance, right?" Gleeson disguised his chuckle with a grunt and gestured to Leo to take a seat on the newly vacated infirmary bed. He jumped onto it, still grinning. Gleeson brought over a bottle of disinfectant, some cotton balls, and some band-aids. As Leo had a few deeper scratches on his arms, which the satyr realized he must have used to protect his face. Gleeson started with the arms first, dipping the cotton balls in the disinfectant and gently wiping them over the scratches. Leo winced a couple times as he went. For a minute, the room was silent, but it wasn't awkward. Gleeson had a feeling that the fight had shaken Leo up a bit, and that he would need a moment where he could just drop his balls and relax a bit, not having to worry about what anyone else was thinking or how they reacted. So he kept his eyes and all his focus on the boy's arms. When he finished, he moved to Leo's face, and as soon as he looked up, he knew the walls were back up. Internally, Gleeson sighed, wishing the walls didn't have to be there in the first place, but he got to work on the kid's face without letting any of it show on his own. That quick thinking was impressive, Gleeson said quietly as he finished up. Leo clearly hadn't expected him to say anything because he jumped slightly before calming and just flashing him another patented Leo grin. What can I say? I'm just amazing like that. Gleeson just shook his head. How'd you even know how to get rid of the Stymphalian birds anyways? And using my CDs as well. Don't think I wouldn't recognize the sound of Rolling Stone, specifically Paint It Black. He had absolutely no idea how Leo had gotten the CD either, playing it as he had never lent it to anyone and stored his CDs in his room. Leo's grin turned into a sheepish smile, rubbing a hand over his curls as he spoke. Annabeth told me during the fight I had already had a sound system almost ready, so I just needed to finish it off and play the music. I set it up for CDs because I knew we were bringing some, and somehow one ended up sitting on Buford in the corner. Honestly, I'm not sure if it was a coincidence or not, but it felt just a bit too good to be true. But we're alive, so that's all that matters. He paused for a second before a momentary flash of panic came across his face as he brought his hand down from his head to gesture in front of him. Oh, and don't worry, I made sure the CD wasn't damaged or anything after the fight ended. He rushed out. Gleeson had to pause for a second, letting the words process before he let out a short, gruff laugh. Valdez, I think I'd care about the crew and ship getting shredded more than a CD, he said, planting his hand on top of Leo's hair and ruffling it. Leo ducked his head to get away from the painless, aggressive affection. Though, if you had broken one of my CDs, we might have had a bit of a talk, he added in a jokingly threatening tone, and felt his heart sink at the small, genuinely happy smile Leo sent him. Felt his heart melt at the small, genuinely happy smile Leo sent him from under his curls. He took a second to just look at Leo, trying to burn the image of the kid really, truly happy, at least for a moment. When he noticed something. Valdez, your shirt is ripped, Gleeson pointed out, reaching his hand down to check the rip. Just as he was about to touch it, Leo jerked backwards, Gleeson's hand freezing in mid-air as he regarded Leo with a mix of suspicion and concern. It's fine, Coach, Leo exclaimed, his voice cheerful. Piper pointed it out, too, and I told her the same thing. Probably just got ripped in the fight. Didn't even notice it until she said anything. I'll just get changed and set this one up later. If Gleeson were to listen only to Leo's voice and words, he'd believe him. Leo was great at getting his clothes torn, both in battle and just regular everyday life. And he did know how to mend clothes. Leo had admitted to Gleeson one night while they were still in the wilderness school that it had been something that his mother had first taught him because of how adept he was at tearing his clothes, even as a child. And was something he got better at as he went through foster homes and was on the run. After all, none of the homes he got into were ever that good, and he wouldn't be able to afford to always buy new clothes when the old ones got dirty or torn. But Gleeson knew Leo's tells. He could see how Leo was chewing the inside of his lower lip and how he was looking down and refusing to even look at Gleeson, let alone make eye contact. Leo was lying, and Piper knew Leo's tells too, so Gleeson had no idea how she had asked him before and somehow not picked up on him lying, recent injury or not. But that was a problem to think about later, because right now, Gleeson had a feeling that Leo was injured. Valdez, you can't fool me, Gleeson said, crossing his arms. Leo glanced up at him for a split second before wincing at his facial expression and looked back down. Leo's back slouched and his shoulders hunched forwards, and Gleeson's heart broke at the realization that he was trying to make himself smaller. He took a second to take a deep breath and let the worried scowl on his face fall and his arms drop before he spoke again. Kid, I'm not angry at you, he started, intentionally trying to make his voice gentler, and his heart broke again at the shock in Leo's expression when he looked up in surprise. I'm not the chaperone. I'm not only the chaperone for this quest, but your protector too. I'm not going to let anyone on the ship go injured without treatment, and certainly not you. Now can I please check your side? The infirmary was silent yet again, this silence a little less comfortable. Gleeson just wanted to make sure Leo was okay, and he was almost holding his breath as he watched Leo's face and the emotions flitting across it as he thought. When Leo nodded and let out a quiet, okay, the satyr let out a silent sigh of relief. You can either take your shirt off completely or just hold it up out of the way, Gleeson explained, whatever you're comfortable with. It'd be easier with your shirt off, but if you don't want to, you don't have to. Another shocked blink from Leo before the boy reached up and tugged the shirt over his head. Gleeson had been suspicious of Leo being injured before. The quiet hiss of pain Leo let out of the movement and the drag of the fabric against his side meant he was certain. Once the shirt was off, Leo tossed it beside him and sat up so Gleeson could see his side better. Sure enough, there was a cut stretching along Leo's skin. It was about 4 inches long and just under the base of Leo's ribs on his left side. It also wasn't that deep enough to bleed, but the bleeding was slow and sluggish rather than gushing out like Piper's injury. Gleeson swore under his breath. It was good that it wasn't as serious as Piper's cut had been, but it was still bad enough to need actual treatment, and Leo had nearly just walked out of the infirmary without anything. It was only then that Gleeson realized that Leo had started getting a bit fidgety, clearly getting worried, as Gleeson didn't say anything and just stared at the wound. Gleeson let out another sigh. "Valdez, this is a pretty bad injury. I'll get you some ambrosia," he said, turning to get some. Leo's hand snapped out and grabbed his wrist. "No." Gleeson froze, turning back to Leo. The longer this went on, the more concerned he got, but he reminded himself to stay calm. Leo was already having a bad enough time already. He didn't need to add to it. "Why not?" he asked. Leo looked down again, clearly nervous and trying to figure out how to explain, though he didn't take his hand off Gleeson's wrist, even after the satyr moved to stand next to the bed again. "We're going through our ambrosia and nectar quickly and quicker than we planned," he eventually managed. "There's been too many situations that we didn't consider, and we're about to go into an even more dangerous part of this quest. If we keep using them for things that aren't serious, then I'm scared we'll end up running out." Gleeson hadn't thought about it before now, but he realized Leo was right. They were going through it fairly quickly, even though it made sense with how many injuries they were getting, and Leo's injury didn't absolutely need nectar or ambrosia. It would be fine with regular mortal treatment. "You're right," he admitted with a sigh. "Even if I don't like it. Wait here. I'll get the things to patch you up." It wasn't a deep cut. All it really needed was to be cleaned and bandaged. Leo let go of Gleeson's wrist, so he quickly went and grabbed some gauze and bandages. Gleeson dipped the new cotton bud in the disinfectant and pulled over the small stool in the corner to sit on so he could reach Leo's wound easily, without having to bend over for too long. He glanced up at Leo quickly, who was looking down at the cotton bud Gleeson was currently holding above his wound, with a fair amount of worry. "This is going to sting a fair bit more than your scratches," Gleeson warned, his voice low and quiet, as calming as he could get it. Maybe hold on to your shirt if you need to squeeze something." Leo did as he suggested, grabbing the shirt in a death grip in his right hand, his left arm held up to get it out of the way for the satyr to work. He cleaned the wound off as quickly as he could, but Leo still let out quiet grunts of pain as the cotton bud dragged across his wound. As soon as Gleeson was done disinfecting the wound, he quickly grabbed the gauze, got Leo to hold it in place for a second, and wrapped the bandages around the boy's torso, holding the gauze in place. "Done," Gleeson announced as he stood up from his stool. "You did well," he added, ruffling Leo's hair again, far less aggressive this time. "Thanks, Coach," he said, looking up at Gleeson again, this time with a tired smile. The kid was probably exhausted, Gleeson realized, after using so much energy in the fight and then having to use even more to get through his injuries being pretty painfully cleaned up. "Go change before dinner," Gleeson instructed. "You've used up a lot of energy today, and you need to get it back for your body to heal correctly." Leo's tired smile morphed into a grin. "Sir, yes, sir," he teasingly chirped, his right hand lifting up into a salute. Gleeson couldn't hide his fond chuckle this time. "Off you go, Valdez, and if you aren't down in the common area before dinner, I am going to drag you down," he said, and the exaggeratedly panicked expression that crossed Leo's face let him know that the boy knew that he was serious. Gleeson started to clean up and put everything away while Leo shrugged his shirt back on, hopped down from the bed, and walked to the door. He opened it, but paused. "Hey, Coach," Leo called, and Gleeson glanced over to see Leo looking back at him, a small, grateful smile tugging on his lips. "Thanks," he said quietly. "See you at dinner." He then scampered out the door, shutting it behind him before Gleeson could respond. Gleeson just stared fondly at him, gently smiling while shaking his head. He probably cared too much about Leo at this point, but who could really blame him? The kid was almost too good for this world, even after all the shit that life had thrown at him, and Gleeson would do anything to make sure Leo knew just how much he was loved. But he knew it'd be a long process, so for now, he just finished tidying up the infirmary and promised himself to keep an eye out and look after Leo no matter what. And that was the first chapter of this fic. I hope you all enjoyed. And I really like this fic because it gives spotlight to Coach Hedge, and we don't often see that in fan fiction. I also really like the relationship between Coach Hedge and Leo in this fic. I really like it. So you can expect to see more of this. And make sure you leave comments and kudos on the original fic. And if you have any suggestions for any Percy Jackson or Epic the Musical Fix from either Ao3 or fanfic.net, I would be happy to hear them. Anyway, bye!